All right. So, Leader Jeffries, when you first performed the ABCs of Democracy, this was on January 7th, 2023, which one was more pronounced? Was it the concern for getting the whole ABCs correct, or was it the looming threat of knowing that if you missed any letter, you'd be attacked by Republicans for not knowing the ABCs?
It was definitely both. When I thought about, well, first of all, it's great to be here, great to be with so many champions of our democracy. So, that week, of course, was an extraordinary week because there were 15 different votes, as you recall, before the other side of the aisle could elect a speaker. And as I was preparing, that week, I knew by tradition, the first person to speak on the House floor in a new Congress is the minority leader prior to passing the gavel to the incoming speaker. And I knew that what I wanted to communicate was that as House Democrats, we were, ready and willing and able to work with our Republican colleagues on any issue, whenever and wherever possible in order to make a difference in the lives of the American people, to try to find bipartisan common ground, but that we were going to push back against extremism whenever necessary, and that we were going to defend American values. And as I was thinking about how I wanted to communicate that, as someone who often tries to use alliteration, I said, well, let me go through A and then B and then C. I got to D, democracy, E, economic opportunity over extremism. And at some point, I concluded, well, maybe I can try to go through the alphabet and contrast that with values that represent the ugly underbelly of any society. And followed my gut and my instinct and decided to move forward with it. Thankfully got through it, but as your question suggests, after I concluded, I said to my team in Washington, I will never attempt that again. They said, why? I said, well, because, on the House floor, other than when the president speaks for the State of the Union address, there's no teleprompter, and I generally try to speak from the heart, no notes, have a sense of what I want to say, but no notes. And so I realized afterward that because there are 26 letters in the alphabet, and then I was doing a compare and contrast, that I had 52 opportunities to make a mistake, easily ascertainable, because I could have skipped over a letter, inverted letters, things of that nature, and I know exactly what would have happened. The right-wing media would have had a field day. New House Democratic leader does not know his ABCs. But thankfully, we got through it and seemingly well received, and decided that it does represent a blueprint for values, for the journey that we're on, for the resilience of the American people in creating the greatest democracy in the history of the world, that we're going to work hard to sustain. And that is, in part, what the book is all about. An illustrated book for people of all ages, the young and the young at heart, who care about our democracy.
So, in digging into the inspiration for the book, can you talk a little bit about who Kid Fresh is?
Well, as I was growing up in Brooklyn, I had two. Brooklyn's always in the house. I love that, wherever I go. And, growing up in central Brooklyn, I had two aspirations, either to be the point guard for the New York Knicks or a hip-hop artist, a rapper. And so I hadn't heard that name in a while, Brian, but I used to go under the name Kid Fresh. Neither career worked out for me, but it's been an honor to to serve the people as a member of the United States Congress.
Is it weird to know that young Hakeem Jeffries would see you not only as you know, the leader of the Democratic Party, but very likely to be the first African American Speaker of the House, and to know that based on his aspirations, kind of didn't really work out?
Well, you know, I mean, I think what is extraordinary, and one of the reasons why many of us, and shout out, of course, to Congressman-elect George Whitesides, we're looking forward to serving with him. The House is such a special place, and for many reasons, but one of the reasons why we believe it's so special is because it is the institution that the framers designed to be the closest to the American people and to reflect in the most authentic way possible, right? The hopes, the dreams, the aspirations, the fears, the concerns, the anxieties, the passions of the American people. It's the reason why the House, of course, has the 2-year term as compared to the presidency, 4 years, the Senate, 6 years. Imagine that, George, must be nice, 6 years. And the Supreme Court, life. Which, by the way, the first opportunity that we get, we will do something about that. We'll do something about that. But, you know, when you think about that constellation, 2, 4, 6, life, right? The House is on one side of that spectrum because the framers wanted the institution to be the closest to the people. And you know, that's really representative democracy at its best, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think it was John Adams, when the House was being conceived, who said that it was to be, ideally, a perfect reflection, a perfect replica, portrait of the American people. To think, to look, to feel like the American people. I'm sure John Adams could have never imagined a Hakeem Sekou Jeffries being in this position, but they did imagine this notion of representative democracy, and it's great to be a part of it.
There's obviously a big inspiration from hip-hop in the book, in the speech. I'm curious because Al Franken came into the Senate and, you know, as a very well-known SNL writer and actor, felt when he came into the Senate like he had to suppress or hide his comedy background actively. And when you came into the House, was there any sense that, okay, to I guess, align yourself more closely with politics, with this idea of how politicians should act and should sound, that actually it would be better to suppress you know, the inspiration that hip hop has had?
You know, it's very interesting because I think consistent with that theory of what the House is supposed to be, for many of us, you know, we believe that you shouldn't go to Washington and have Washington change you. You should bring yourself to Washington and try to change Washington for the better. And, you know, and so for me, that's, you know, growing up in Brooklyn, that's the Black church experience, certainly my training in the art and science of the law. But definitively coming of age, you know, during the golden age of hip hop in the late 80s into the 90s as being a very important part of my journey. And the House and the Senate, two very interesting institutions. I spent some time as an impeachment manager during the first impeachment trial over in the Senate. And when I got back over to the House, a lot of my colleagues said, you know, what's the difference between the House and the Senate? Tell us about your experiences. I had to think about it for a moment, and then I concluded the best way I could explain it, and this may explain some of Senator Franken's perspectives, is that the House is like public school and the Senate's like private school. Now, in terms of the House, it's difficult to get into. It's a magnet school, y'all. But, you know, it's big, it's diverse, it can be unruly. It's like a public school. And we embrace that and try to bring all of what that should represent, your own personality and perspective and life experiences to the institution.
And so knowing what we know now about this election, where it really was a referendum on authenticity, on relatability, I mean, this is different now, right? Like now I feel like it's almost a liability to have to sound more like a politician. And so does that inform a little bit of how you can go moving forward, given your background? I mean, you have the ability to, you know, with your having hip hop be an inspiration in your life, you have something that a lot of people don't have. Is that going to inform a little bit of how you move forward?
I definitely think that, you know, across the ideological spectrum, authenticity is important. And, you know, the people want their elected officials to be real and deserve their elected officials to be real. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't operate within certain norms and conduct yourself, you know, with a respect for others, regardless of race or religion or gender or sexual orientation. You should respect everyone, but also, you know, be yourself and be as real as you can be. I confronted this in a very small way when I had my first Oval Office meeting. And this was in the early part of my first year as House Democratic leader. And, you know, I was told that there was going to be a White House meeting with the 4 legislative leaders, and it would be President Biden. I walk in, it's President Biden, it's Vice President Harris. At the time it was Speaker McCarthy, it was Leader McConnell, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and myself. And my first reaction was, how did they let Hakeem Jeffries into this room? Right? I mean, just an amazing thing. Representative democracy, government of the people, by the people, and for the people at its best. But I had a decision to make in terms of attire. Now, normally when I'm on the Hill, I'm dressed with a tie, but in the way that I'm dressed right now. And the first question that I had to confront was, am I going to wear my sneakers to the Oval Office? And in the spirit of authenticity, that's exactly what I did. And they would dress sneakers. But, you know, and of course that became the big story. And thankfully, McConnell had something that seemed like sneakers, or at least it created a situation where I didn't totally become the fall guy. But it was a small thing, but to your point, it was also the authentic thing to do, still showing respect and reverence for the office, of course, and how I conducted myself in the meeting, but also recognizing that being yourself is critically important.
Was McConnell wearing a tan suit?
McConnell was not wearing a tan suit.
All right. Yeah. But let the record show that McConnell does wear tan suits, and it didn't seem to be a problem when he did it. Okay, so let's get
This is a good point, too, by the way, because if you think about President Obama and Vice President, well, of course, then Vice President Biden, but President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama, just dignity and class and integrity and intellect, no scandal, no indictments, no convictions, no problems, no drama, and the only thing they could point to was a tan suit.
So let's dig into the moment that we're in right now. I know that in the aftermath of this election, we're heading into a moment of uncertainty, not just because of the prospect of Donald Trump's second term, but also a Democratic base that, for all intents and purposes, may not have the same level of willingness to resist as everybody did in 2017. And so how do you move forward knowing that there is a certain degree of exhaustion, knowing that we do have to pick our battles? How are you moving forward given the landscape? Yeah,
I think from my perspective, the election has occurred, the voters have spoken, and the former president is on his way back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And so as House Democrats, we've taken the position that we will work to find common ground with the incoming administration on issues of importance to the American people, first and foremost, driving down the high cost of living, for working class Americans, middle class Americans, low income Americans all across the country. Find that bipartisan common ground to try to solve problems for hardworking American taxpayers, but at the same period of time, push back against far-right extremism and be very clear in our perspectives when we talk to our Republican colleagues that we're going to protect Social Security, we're going to protect Medicare, we're going to protect Medicaid, we're going to protect the Affordable Care Act, we're going to protect the progress that we've made on the climate crisis, and we will always protect the woman's freedom to make her own reproductive health care decisions.
The first battle coming up is obviously these confirmation battles. This happens in the Senate and not the House, but everything is intertwined anyway. What do you think the Democrats should do right now, facing the prospect of a potential HHS secretary in RFK Jr., a potential FBI director in Kash Patel, a potential Secretary of Defense in Pete Hegseth, and on, knowing that perhaps we have limited capital in the minority?
Well, I think it was Abraham Lincoln who once made the observation that public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And I think that when you don't have the gavels to be able to necessarily control the levers in an affirmative way of what happens from a governmental standpoint, that the best tool that you have to help shape policy and to stop bad things from happening is public sentiment. And in that regard, we certainly have to lean into a disciplined approach and message as much as we can with simplicity and repetition, right? Which is the formula for being able to convince and persuade the American people. Simplicity and repetition. Now, it's a challenge because I think one of the strategies that we've seen from the other side of the aisle is that they're just going to flood the zone with outrageous behavior. But we can't chase every outrage. We are going to have to make sure that we can connect the dots as it relates to the outrageous things that take place, and including some of the clearly unfit cabinet nominations that have taken place, but try to connect it with a common narrative and a common theme, which we'll work, together on with our partners in the Senate and, the great governors that we have all across the country. My sense, at least as of the moment, is that when you nominate so many unqualified folks, in the aftermath of the incoming president saying repeatedly that we're going to have nothing but the best, we're going to have the best economy, we're going to have the best border security, we're going to have the best administration, and then you nominate individuals who clearly don't represent the best of America, what is this all about? How does this impact the American people in a positive way? What does any of this have to do with lowering, the high cost of living, with dealing with grocery prices and housing prices and the high cost of childcare, the things that the American people are legitimately concerned about? But we're going to have to do it in a way that, weaves together a common theme, a common narrative, with the simplicity and repetition that allows you to penetrate with the American people.
One of those unqualified nominees was Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. He's since withdrawn himself from consideration, very much because he didn't want the House ethics report to come out. That ethics report was still a taxpayer-funded report. Is there any likelihood that we'll be able to see it, knowing full well that Matt Gaetz, as a career politician, is likely to return to politics, even if it's in the capacity of running for governor of Florida, for example? But to my earlier point, that was a taxpayer-funded report. Do the people of America have the right to be able to see what was in it?
Yes, I think the senators were very clear. Both Democratic senators and Republican senators, and many of us in the House, took the same position, that certainly when he was the nominee for the highest law enforcement position in the land, it was information that should have been made publicly available to the Senate and to the American people. Now, there are some limitations in what the House is able to do from the standpoint of releasing a report related to a individual who's no longer a member of the House. But there will be ongoing discussions about how we can deal with this particularly unique dynamic. As you indicated, Matt Gaetz is unlikely to be finished with his pursuit for public office or even pursuit for a position within the administration that may not relate to a high stakes confirmation battle. So, to be continued as it relates to that particular report. I do think the broader principle at issue that was a test, an early test of the resilience of our constitutional system did relate to Matt Gaetz's nomination being put forward and there being such a backlash, including from some Senate Republicans on the other side of the aisle. One of the things I talk about in the book, connected to the letter C, is the principle of the Constitution over the cult. And what caused me to lean into that framing really related to a speech that George Washington gave at the very end of his presidency. And remember that term limits wasn't put into place for the President of the United States until the mid-1940s. And so at the time, George Washington, patriotic hero, general, leader of the American Revolution, incredibly popular. Many people believe that he could become potentially the first American king, but chose to walk away from the office. And in his final speech, his farewell address to the nation, he said something that has always stuck with me when I became aware of it, which was that the Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all. Applies to everyone. The poorest American all the way through to the President of the United States and all points in between. Sacredly obligatory upon all. And one of those constitutional principles is the notion of checks and balances, separate and co-equal branches of government, and that in the Senate, this principle of advice and consent. And I'm thankful that at least in the first test of it all, we'll see what remains in the next few weeks, in the next few months, but in the first test, those senators took that principle seriously. Matt Gaetz was clearly not the right person to be the Attorney General of the United States of America. Matt Gaetz will not be the Attorney General of the United States of America.
Speaking of what the Constitution says about respecting term limits, obviously that brings to mind some of Trump's comments, whether in jest or not, about the prospect of serving a third term. He immediately made some joke to members of the House Republican Conference. Do you have any words to reassure folks who will hear stuff like that, and whether he actually means it, or whether he's just saying it to troll the libs and get a rise out of the left, notwithstanding, do you have any words to reassure folks who might be worried about the prospect of, to contrast with George Washington possibly being the first king and then opting not to in deference to the Constitution, this renewed prospect of Donald Trump being the first American king?
With respect to this upcoming term,
I apologize for
That's right.
the way that those words landed on folks.
That's right. Well, I'm very confident. I'm glad you asked the question. I'm very confident that in terms of the next 4 years, Donald Trump is one and done. It's over. It's over. We got to get through it, and we'll work hard to get through the first 100 days, the first year, the first midterm election, and then thereafter. But the Constitution is very clear, and the only way to change the Constitution is through an incredibly high bar from a legislative standpoint. Even if every single Republican in the country wanted to do it, it's not a simple majority in the House or the Senate. It's 2/3 of the House and the Senate. And then If in fact somehow you were able to breach that barrier, which is impossible to breach by this incoming president, then 3/4 of the states would actually have to ratify that constitutional change, which we know 3/4 of the states would never do either. That's an impossible barrier to breach. And so there was a reason why the framers made it so difficult to change the Constitution, and I'm thankful that they did.
So I want to talk a little bit about this election that just passed. What went wrong, and what could Democrats do better?
We're not holding back with these questions, as should be the case. As should be the case. Definitely, we are engaged in a process, of introspection and after-action analysis, because there are so many people, including those that I represent, by and large, back at home in Brooklyn, understandably, disappointed and dismayed, by the results. It was, at the end of the day, a very close election, but a close election that broke against the vice president in each of the 7 battleground states by a point or two, or a little bit more, but certainly in the key states, only by about a point or two at most. But it did break against us. I do think that the American people are frustrated that more has not been done to improve their quality of life, not simply over the last few years, but for decades. And that has been exacerbated, of course, by the post-pandemic inflationary environment that existed all across the world, but certainly here in the United States of America. And it's appropriate that working-class Americans and middle-class Americans and low-income Americans don't view the economy through the lens of how many jobs have been created, and there was record job creation, or even the unemployment rate, and it was at a historic low. Record creation of small businesses. Stock market, of course, was at an all-time high prior to the election, continues to move in the right direction based on the Biden-Harris economy. Almost by every macroeconomic measure, things have been moving in the right direction. But working-class Americans, of course, are going to view the economy through housing prices or child care costs, gas prices, which were very high in the years immediately following the end of the pandemic, and certainly grocery prices. What am I paying for food, for eggs, for milk, for bread, and things of that nature? And the party in power is often going to be punished electorally when that happens. And that's part of the reality, I think, of what we confronted, that the high cost of living became a dominant issue, and we weren't able to convince the American people, or enough of the American people, that we were on the right side of that issue. I also think that for decades, this contract that exists here in the United States of America, which is that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to provide a comfortable living for yourself, for your family, purchase a home, educate your children, have access to high-quality health care, go on vacation every now and then, one day retire with grace and dignity. That's the American dream. And for far too many people in this country, working-class people of every race, they've concluded that that American dream is out of reach, that the contract has been broken, and that they're frustrated that more hasn't been done to change the situation. And there are a lot of explanations for it. Poorly negotiated trade deals that cost the country, particularly the heartland, lots of jobs, towns shutting down because factories and plants closed down and were no longer recognizable as those towns throughout many parts of the country, right? The outsourcing of good-paying American jobs, the dramatic decline of unionization, recently reversing itself to some degree, but not reversing what has happened over the last 40 to 50 years, and perhaps particularly beginning with Ronald Reagan's attack on unionized workers in the federal workforce and breaking the Air Traffic Controllers Union at the time. And then, of course, the rise of automation and innovation, which is a tremendous gift in so many ways, but also cost jobs. So these factors have been conspiring against everyday Americans for a long period of time. And I think it's going to be our job in Washington, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans, to reverse this trend and make sure that the great American middle-class dream is alive and well for everyone in the land.
The frustrating part from that perspective is you've got this acute pain being felt by the working class across this country. And you look at what Democrats were able to accomplish in the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, and that was the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, the PACT Act, the CHIPS Act, the infrastructure law, the gun safety law, adding 16 million jobs. Unemployment rate is at a 50-year low. Jobs are surging right now. Stock market is at a record high. And you contrast that, not to mention bringing the cost of insulin down to $35, bringing the cost of inhalers down to $35, automatic refunds for airline cancellations, eliminating junk fees at banks. I've done this spiel a lot. The whole thing. You contrast that with what Donald Trump used his political capital on when he was president the first time, and that was a tax cut where 83% of the benefits were conferred to millionaires and billionaires. And the difficult part becomes reconciling how he was able to once again win over the working class, even after he's already shown that his first appeal using this whole populist shtick was complete bullshit, and then Democrats did use their political capital to help the working class at every turn, and yet where was the disconnect there? Because we were willing to walk the walk, and yet it wasn't felt by the vast majority of Americans, and yet Trump, who's already shown his hand, who's already shown that he's not willing to walk the walk, he was able to slide in again using the same tricks that he used the first time, even after he's shown that there's no basis to it.
We definitely have to do a better job in communicating with the American people that we actually have the answers to make sure we create an economy that works for everyone. Now, the accomplishments under the Biden-Harris administration that you articulated, phenomenal. And, I think when the history books are written, will be fully appreciated in terms of the transformative nature of making life better for everyday Americans across the spectrum, and really doing common sense things like infrastructure or lowering the high price of life-saving prescription drugs, largest investment in combating the climate crisis in the history of the world as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, gun safety legislation, standing up for our veterans, rescuing the economy from the once-in-a-century pandemic. But this has been a bigger challenge for Democrats over the years, and I've on occasion observed that part of the issue that we as Democrats have had is that Republicans talk in headlines and Democrats talk in fine print. And
I think it's Al Franken who says, Al Franken has this joke about Democrats' bumper stickers always end in continued on next bumper sticker.
That's right. I think it's an astute observation. Now, the reason why we tend to talk in fine print is because if you care about governing, you have to master the fine print. And we've done a tremendous job of it, going all the way back to the beginning of the modern-day Democratic Party, FDR and rural electrification, Social Security through the Civil Rights era and Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act and Fair Housing Act and Medicare and Medicaid and Head Start and the Elementary and Secondary School Act, the Higher Education Act, all the way through the Obama years of the Affordable Care Act, running through the Biden years, from the American Rescue Plan through everything we talked about, concluding with the Inflation Reduction Act. Every single one of those things, making life better for the American people, all brought to you by your friendly neighborhood Democratic Party. That's an incredible track record. You don't deliver things like that to the American people unless you master the fine print. But the challenge, of course, is that while you govern in fine print, you message, you persuade, you communicate in headlines. And clearly we have not done a good enough job of doing that. And one of the things that we're going to work as hard as we can on is to reverse that reality. Reverse that reality. I've made the observation at times to try to drive home the importance of this point. And, Democrats consistently deliver an economy that is much better for everyday Americans than Republicans, consistently. And yet, you just take one statistic. I think 7 out of the last 8 recessions have happened under Republican presidents. Take another statistic. I think since 1989, there have been 3 Republican presidents, 3 Democratic presidents. 51 million jobs in the private sector created in that period of time. 49 million created under Democratic presidents. So you sit back and you look at all these statistics, stock market the same, wage growth the same, unemployment low the same, all on the Democratic side of the equation. And so then that causes you to have to ask the question, why is it that when you talk to the American people, they will say Republicans are better off on the economy? To me, that's messaging, communication. That's the failure to connect, even though the facts are there. It reminds me of, when you ask the American people, as compared to asking boxing experts, who is the greatest boxer of all time? If you ask the boxing experts, the people who study the sweet science of boxing, you'll get a variety of different answers, right? Some will say Joe Louis, others will say Rocky Marciano, some will say Sugar Ray Robinson, others will say Sugar Ray Leonard, some will say Floyd Mayweather, others will say Marvin Hagler, some will say Tommy Hearns, some will say Oscar De La Hoya. You get the point. Multiple answers, right? Muhammad Ali. When you ask the American people who's the greatest boxer of all time, for decades, survey after survey after survey, the same answer: Muhammad Ali. Now, they all had incredible track records, which is why boxing experts will give you 8 or 9 or 10 different names. But why is it that the American people have consistently said Muhammad Ali? I've got to believe that in part it's because every single time you put a microphone in front of Muhammad Ali's face, he said the same exact thing: I am the greatest. Simplicity and repetition. And so we got to follow the Muhammad Ali school of messaging, even though the facts are with us.
And so does that inform how you are moving forward? Because we have listened to Trump for the better part of a decade, bellow out these three-word like fascistic nursery rhymes: build the wall, lock her up, make America great again, over and over and over until they're seared into our cerebral cortexes. And we do see a lot of Republicans lean heavily on messaging. I believe it was Madison Cawthorn who didn't even have legislative staff. He had comm staff because he wasn't interested in legislating. He was interested in making sure that he could get whatever message out. It didn't matter if he had any legislation to back it up. He was interested in talking to the American people. There's largely no incentive structure for a lot of Republican members of Congress to legislate when they could just move forward with building their brand. I'm talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and some of these stars of the Republican Party. But how does that inform? And you look at somebody like Ted Cruz, spends more time podcasting than he does actually sponsoring or passing any legislation. And so how is that going to inform how Democrats move forward, knowing that we might have the chops when it comes to writing legislation, when it comes to serving the needs of the American people, but at the end of the day, it's not going to matter if nobody knows like what's being put forward because the messaging isn't up to the same par.
Which is absolutely why we have to do both. We have to govern effectively to deliver for the American people, and whenever we have that opportunity to do so, we have to continue to advance the ball in an enlightened and transformative fashion, and we have a great track record as Democrats of doing that. But we also have to message effectively, because that's the only way to convince the American people that we should be given the levers of government so that we can deliver on their behalf. And that's going to be incredibly significant, and particularly when we don't have majorities in the House and the Senate. It goes back to this principle of helping to make sure that you can convince the American people as to you being on the right side of a given issue and shaping public sentiment in that regard. And Democrats have, been able to do it successfully, particularly in midterm elections. And of course, Barack Obama famously did it successfully on the campaign trail when he first ran, and it was "Yes, we can, hope and change." That's 6 words, right? And everyone could tell you what Barack Obama stood for. He had an incredible agenda that he worked on to get over the finish line, particularly during the first 2 years when he had majorities in the Congress, and that led to the transformative, Affordable Care Act. But when he communicated with the American people and was trying to make the case for sending him to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, it was simplicity and repetition. It was 6 words: "Yes, we can," and of course, hope and change. And I think there's value in being able to do that, particularly in an environment where everyday Americans, of course, if you're struggling to live paycheck to paycheck, you don't have time to read extensive policy white papers, right? And you may get your news from a variety of different sources, many of which are unconventional. And I think we're going to have to lean into new media, non-traditional media, to make sure that we're reaching every corner of where the American people are found.
Which is a great point, and as a member of new media, I'm able to see here that there is a difference between our message and our message distribution system. So how do you view, moving forward, the role of legacy media versus independent media in light of an election cycle where we've largely been able to see that not only is legacy media not on Democrats' side in the same way that right-wing media is, for all intents and purposes, a propaganda arm of the Republican Party. And so how do you move forward under this new landscape?
Well, yeah, I think definitively, our plans in the next Congress and as we prepare, for the 2026 midterm elections will be the first opportunity for the American people, once again, to weigh in across the nation on the direction that we should go in. As a country, I've said to my colleagues in Washington that we have one mission in 2 parts, over the next 2 years. One mission in 2 parts. One, we have to stop Project 2025. And 2, we have to implement Project 2026, take back control of the House of Representatives, so we can begin to move the country back in the right direction. And in order for us to do both, the governing side and what needs to happen when we get another opportunity to make our case to the American people, we do have to go beyond legacy media and reach the American people where they are at. And that, of course, ranges from, messaging app communication to podcasts to gaming, to social media.
You ready to bolster your Fortnite skills? You can be on Twitch.
I'm going to leave that to Maxwell Frost and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They can handle that.
You had mentioned Project 2025, and there is one element of Project 2025 that I've been concerned about. I'm sure a lot of people who've heard about it are concerned about it too, and that is the potential implementation of Schedule F, and that is this idea of reclassifying career civil servants who make up the DOJ, the FBI, the IRS, the FCC, you name it, and replacing them with political loyalists, people whose adherence would be not to the Constitution, but rather to Donald Trump. What is the likelihood of him being successful at implementing something like this, and what's the ability of Democrats from the minority in being able to block something like this?
Yeah, I mean, this is gonna be an all-hands-on-deck effort, right? That you are gonna have tight majorities in the House and also to some degree in the Senate. You still have the filibuster in the Senate. Legislatively, it'll be very difficult for the incoming administration to accomplish a lot of these objectives with the degree of permanence that they might otherwise hope to be able to do because of the firewall that exists, not simply in the Senate, where you have to get north of or to 60 votes, but even in the House, where it looks like we're going to, though falling short and being very disappointed in that regard, at most you'll have 220 Republicans. Looks like we will get to 215 Democrats. Have already picked up 2 seats in California and perhaps on our way to a third. Thank you, California, for an incredible job. And we were able to do a similar thing in New York, where we flipped 4 seats this year, including 3 Republicans defeated on election night. All of which means that the Republicans will be beginning this Congress with the smallest majority of any incoming majority since before the Great Depression. And that's when they are at full strength at 220. But because there are at least 3 vacancies, Matt Gaetz has now resigned and indicated that he's not coming back. And then 2 additional current House Republicans who are on their way into the Trump administration. For the first 100 days plus of the new administration, the numbers are likely to be 217 Republicans, 215 Democrats, which means that Republicans can't lose a single vote, because ties in the House of Representatives means the legislation fails. And with such a fractious conference that they have on the other side of the aisle, the handful of common sense traditional Republicans that exist, who are in swing seats, just the facts, y'all. And then, of course, a growing and ascendant far-right group of extreme Republicans led by the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world. It's going to be very difficult for them to move anything that is hyper-aggressive, with Democrats remaining unified. And we're going to have to be unified on behalf of the American people in the next Congress and over the next 4 years.
So I know this isn't your jurisdiction, but I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you anyway. In terms of the House seats that were added in this election cycle, we did see that New York and California were in large part responsible for closing the gap. Of course, there was North Carolina that was responsible for widening the gap, and that was the direct result of those 3 gerrymandered seats, which means that the fact that Republicans will control the House is owed, at this point, almost exclusively to the fact that Republicans were able to gerrymander. But if you look at a state like California, if you look at a state like New York, we have independent redistricting commissions. And when Republicans have control of certain states, and these are liberal bastions, right? When Republicans have control of states, they gerrymander the everlasting hell out of those states. And so is there some sense of, well, I feel like there is a sense of unilateral disarmament happening. And so until such time as we have some type of National Voting Rights Act that would prohibit gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, would you be for or against this idea of Democrats not unilaterally disarming, not implementing this idea of independent redistricting commissions when we have control, only to effectively cede control to Republicans because they refuse to do it?
It's a very important observation. I do think that, the principle of making sure that the American people can choose their representatives, as opposed to wannabe representatives choosing the people they want to represent, which leads to the extreme partisan gerrymandering and takes away the power to determine your own destiny from the American people. That's the problem with extreme partisan gerrymandering, and we've got to end it across the country. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court fell short by 1 vote in a decision a few years ago in prohibiting extreme partisan gerrymandering under the Constitution. So it's going to fall upon Democrats to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, which we are prepared to do the moment that we have the ability to do it, which is comprehensive democracy reform legislation that would, among other things, prohibit extreme partisan gerrymandering. figuring out what we do in the interim. Now, New York and California, we flipped a total, it looks like, of 7 seats this year. We did it the old-fashioned way. We earned it, right? But if you take a step back and look at the 4 biggest states in the country, California, Texas, Florida, New York, 2 blue states, 2 red states. We don't operate under the same set of rules, right? If it was the case that either all 4 states could gerrymander or none of the 4 states could gerrymander, Democrats would be in control of the House of Representatives right now, and it wouldn't even be close. But what we are dealing with is a system where New York and California are constitutionally prohibited from engaging in partisan gerrymandering, and that is the right, good government policy. But it does create a political disadvantage because Texas and Florida are free to gerrymander and have done so aggressively in numbers that go far beyond the 3-vote margin that will exist in terms of the difference between who's in the majority and who's not in the majority. And North Carolina is just the latest example of this reality. Wiley Nickel, who couldn't run for re-election because his district was gerrymandered outside of the normal time frame of post-census redistricting, has pointed out that in North Carolina, it's a 50-50 state, even as evidenced by the most recent election. We were talking about this, Brian, a little earlier. Trump wins North Carolina, close, but he wins it. And at the same time, on the same day, with the same set of voters, Democrats win every single constitutional office in North Carolina: the governor, the attorney general, the lieutenant governor, who's independently elected, and the state Supreme Court race won by a Democrat. It's a 50-50 state. And heading into this election, before the extreme partisan gerrymandering by Republicans, the North Carolina delegation was 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. That makes sense when you have fair lines in a 50-50 state. But they gerrymandered those lines in connection with this most recent election, and now the delegation in North Carolina and the new Congress will be 10 Republicans, 4 Democrats, accounting for the 3-seat difference that will exist in the House of Representatives. So we're going to have to, I think, just double and triple down on our efforts to make sure that we can even the playing field in a good government way as best we can all across the country. And that's going to require national legislation, and that, of course, will require us to take back the House and take back the Senate.
Is there a change in mentality that's kind of owed here? Because oftentimes it does feel like Democrats kind of don't learn from the mistakes of the past. It feels like Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie over and over. And Democrats have this sense of conferring goodwill onto Republicans in hopes that it'll be reciprocated, and yet the reciprocation never happens. And so, for example, with Merrick Garland spending nearly 2 years not opening an investigation into Donald Trump because he and the Department of Justice and the administration were focused on not offering up the optics of politicization. What did we get for that? We got the Weaponization of Government Subcommittee, which blamed the Democrats for doing the very thing that we didn't do. And so we, again, confer all of this goodwill onto Republicans in hope that it'll buy us something, and it doesn't buy us anything. And so is there, again, to my earlier question, is there a change of mentality that's due here? Because the asymmetry at play is just so obvious, and I'm sure it's frustrating for you. It's frustrating for us on the outside, and I feel like at some point we have to recognize that when both parties aren't playing by the same rules, there comes a time when we recognize that we're not going to win under the current, guidelines that we're operating under.
I think it's fair to say, at least in terms of how we view things in the House, one, we definitely understand many of our Republican colleagues, masters of projection, right? If they're saying one thing about us, they basically are saying that about themselves. And, I'm very clear that, we're dealing with an adversary on the other side of the aisle, far-right extremists, not the traditional Republicans, but the far-right extremists, where facts don't matter, hypocrisy is not a constraint to their behavior, and many have actually concluded that shamelessness is a superpower. This is what we're dealing with, and we've got to be very clear-eyed as it relates to that reality and be strong and resilient in that regard. I think we also have to understand that in a democracy, that the pendulum does swing back and forth. Sometimes in dramatic ways, sometimes in what many of us would view as inexplicable ways. But that has been the reality of our journey, particularly over the last 45 years or so. We go from George H.W. Bush, who has 4 years, to Bill Clinton, who has 8 years. Bill Clinton then yields to George W. Bush, who gets 8 years, who then yields to Barack Obama, who has 8 years. Barack Obama, of course, yields to the former president, Donald Trump, who has 4 years, who then yields back to President Joe Biden.
Well,
Yeah.
Yields.
Right.
Yields is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that one.
Yeah. Say that the will of the American people was that he yields, of course, to Joe Biden. And then now, of course, the pendulum will swing back for 4 years to the incoming president. And I think, one of the things that suggests to me, particularly for young people, and I know there are young people in the audience, and thank you for your willingness to engage civically and your concerns for the country. You are the future. And when I talk to young people about political engagement, I often reflect upon the fact that, politics can be tough. Disappointment is a reality of participating in the political process, that it will not always go your way, even if the facts and the values and the narrative suggest that it should. I recall, I ran twice for a seat in the New York State Assembly, and I lost twice before I won my first race. And, I remember reflecting upon that, but then, of course, thinking about other people, some of whom went on to become presidents of the United States of America. George W. Bush lost his first congressional race. He subsequently, at some point, became the president of the United States. Bill Clinton lost his first congressional race. And he lost his first congressional race in 1974, which was a wave year for Democrats. He may have been the only Democrat in 1974 that lost a competitive race against a Republican. It was a wave year for Democrat. He lost, but of course, came back. Barack Obama, if you can believe it, lost his first congressional race by about 26 points to former Congressman Bobby Rush. Bobby Rush never let us forget that fact, by the way. But I realize, and Churchill, I think, said it best when he made the observation that success is not final, failure is not fatal. At the end of the day, all that matters is the courage to continue. The courage to continue. And I've said it a different way, Brian, that a knockdown is different from a knockout. That's the Hakeem Jeffries remix, y'all. But success is not final, failure is not fatal. All that matters at the end of the day is the courage to continue to eventually get to the place where we would like to take the country.
Now, I know in the aftermath of this election and the lead up to the election focused a lot on the dangers of the prospect of a Trump presidency. Now we are heading toward Trump's presidency in January of 2025. And there is a lot of concern among people who, I think rightly, are worried about what that might mean, what it might mean not just for this presidency in the next 4 years, but democracy more broadly. What reassurance can you give to people who are worried that our system might not be able to hold? And I ask this because, similar to my last question, it does feel like a lot of the ability of our government to function is predicated on a mutual respect from both parties of the government itself. But when one party no longer cares about norms or institutions and a lot of the stuff, the fabric that holds everything together, then really that's when things kind of start to fall apart. A lot of this stuff isn't written in stone. It's not in the Constitution. It's just the fabric of what makes things work. And it continues to work because people respect precedent, respect the government as it stands right now, and do respect norms and institutions. Trump has shown that he doesn't. And so how do you offer some reassurance when a lot of that fabric is held together by just mutual respect that might go away?
Well, that certainly is one of the reasons why I wrote the book and wanted to make it as accessible as possible to the greatest number of people possible, and utilizing the lens of the alphabet in connection with vivid illustrations to try to bring to life the fact that we have been on a 248-year journey as a country. We're going to approach our 250th birthday on July 4th of 2026. And there have been trials and tribulations. There's been turbulence and trouble throughout that journey. There have been ups and downs and highs and lows, of course. And, presidents come, presidents go, elections come, elections go. There are people who are delighted at the results of those elections. There are people who are bitterly disappointed. But through it all, there are values, there are norms, there are institutions, there are ideas that have held this country together over that 248-year journey. I try to capture many of them in the book to try to make the point that we can be resilient, we can power through this. There's a reason why America is the greatest democracy in the history of the world. And yes, we're not a perfect country, and the framers didn't create a perfect country, and they, of course, like all humans, were imperfect in many ways, but they did set us on a march toward a more perfect union. And these values, these norms, these ideas have kept us together. And now is a time not to run away from those ideas and principles, but to lean into them and to recognize that the same resilience that has gotten us through this point is a resilience that can continue to allow us to make sure that there are brighter days ahead of us as we emerge through the storm. I was with the Attorney General in New York the other day, Tish James, as we were preparing to celebrate the 100th birthday, which was just on November 30th, of Shirley Chisholm, who, of course, is a phenomenal public servant. And, I represent many of the districts that Shirley Chisholm many of the neighborhoods that Shirley Chisholm once represented, and that's an amazing thing to stand on the shoulders of Shirley Chisholm. But what the Attorney General, Tish James, said, and she's a fierce leader, Tish James. I say often when I get asked about Tish James, I say, well, she's Brooklyn's dream and Donald Trump's worst nightmare. But what she said was that when there's a storm, eagles don't land on the ground. They continue flying in the air. They just fly above the storm until it passes. They stay engaged. And I thought it was an important observation that for all of us, it's going to be important to stay engaged. Yes, it's necessary for people to take a step back, as needed from the intensity that has existed in the run-up to a campaign, through the holidays as needed, but, to stay engaged in this continuing, battle for what America should continue to represent.
So we have some audience questions that were submitted. I believe we have one question per person, so we have 1,200 questions here. So I'm going to read some here, and we'll do our best to get through them. The first one is, Senator Mitch McConnell has recently emerged as, quote, liberated from the confines of being Senate Majority Leader and has indicated that he opposes not only some of Trump's cabinet picks, but some of his policies as well. Does the House have any such Republicans who are willing to stand up to Trump, and what do you think McConnell's impact will be moving forward?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I do think he is seemingly somewhat liberated, and that at least manifested itself around the Matt Gaetz matter, and may continue to manifest itself, and that could be a very positive thing for the country in terms of some pushback. I don't expect uniform pushback from any Senate Republicans, but we know that Lisa Murkowski is going to stand strong in a lot of different areas, and Susan Collins hopefully will
be concerned enough to push back as well?
Right. We understand that there's some challenges there. She was with us on the Affordable Care Act, but we understand that there's some challenges there. So I think it is going to be important strategically, though, to figure out, in what areas can you identify 4 Republican senators to partner with in order to block bad things from happening so we can get through the next 2 years. Because those will be the numbers that are required in the Senate. Now, the interesting thing is because of the tightness in the House to the question, you need even less than that in order to stop bad things from happening. And there are some traditional Republicans, particularly many who are in swing districts, who are going to have to answer to their constituents in 2 short years that don't have the benefit of the 6-year term, and will be right back before the American people. And I think, it's going to be incumbent upon us to make sure that we're communicating with the people that those individuals represent, so that those members of Congress can't go back home and pretend like they're moderates and go on TV and talk like moderates, but govern in Washington, D.C. with the far-right extremists. And it's going to be incumbent upon us to make sure we expose that. We had some success in doing that in New York and California, and we have to keep that up.
The mass deportations that Donald Trump promises will cripple agriculture and so many other industries across the country, not to mention their humanitarian impact. Is there a way that the Democratic caucuses in Congress can stop this? Well,
that certainly is a conversation that we are having with a lot of advocacy groups in places all across the country. Because while we understand that we have a broken immigration system and we need to secure the border and we need a safe and a strong border that's also humane, and we need to figure out how we can create legal pathways towards citizenship, and we have to fix this broken immigration system, but we should do it in a comprehensive way and in a bipartisan way, that mass deportations, we believe, are not consistent with who we are as a country. And the principle that, yes, we are a nation anchored in the rule of law, but we also are a nation of immigrants. And the American people don't want to see families wantonly broken up. Yes, it's important to deport violent felons, people who present a risk to everyday Americans of every race. And in communities across the country, that's something that's understood. But this notion of mass deportation, which is, we believe, largely impractical, both from a resource standpoint and from an execution standpoint. But we, of course, should take the incoming president at his word. Certainly some of the folks like Stephen Miller around him are going to want. And isn't he from California, y'all? I don't know what happened with Stephen Miller. But we have Elise Stefanik, so it happens. We're taking the issue seriously. We will mobilize with the full weight of, the network of members of Congress, members of the Senate, advocacy groups, and, again, we'll have to make sure that public sentiment, which we believe will be with us, is able to push back against enough Republicans to stop this from happening. Remember, we stopped the Affordable Care Act from being repealed when Republicans had control of the House and the Senate during the former president's first term. And in fact, when Donald Trump took office in January of 2017, there were 241 Republicans in the House and only 194 Democrats. And so he's in a very different situation. We were successful in the Congress, even with big margins in the House and in the Senate, compared to what he will have this time around in stopping the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which was his #1 political priority. We can summon that same resilience and strength and message discipline and organizing skill to stop the type of aggressive anti-American mass deportations from happening.
I should also mention, and it might be cold comfort right now, but I should also mention that if we rewind to 2017, within 2 years we would usher in the biggest House majority in modern American history in the first midterm election cycle. So that is something that we can, cold comfort though it may be right now, it is something that we were able to look forward to as an immediate check to Trump's first term. Here's another question we got. In your ABC speech to Congress, which was widely publicized, there were some audible boos from members of the House. What did you make of that when they were pretty noble and obvious concepts?
Well,
like the idea of somebody booing America over autocracy.
Yeah. Well, the loudest objections were clearly coming from a recognizable figure, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so I understood that I needed to just not be distracted because her objective was to try to distract me from being able to, get through my remarks, and I wasn't going to let that happen. In particular, there was an audible reaction when I got to the letter M and said maturity over Mar-a-Lago. She booed aggressively, and it reinforced that it was exactly the right thing for me to say.
How can congressional Democrats mitigate the Supreme Court's immunity decision so that presidents are held accountable for illegal acts under the law?
Well, that's going to be a challenge as of the moment. That's just the reality, unfortunately, of the situation in the short term. But I think what is important, and Liz Cheney actually made this observation recently, that though the Supreme Court decision related to presidential immunity in a way that many of us may believe is inconsistent with the principle of a nation anchored in the rule of law, not the rule of man, that it is limited to only the President of the United States. And there are a whole lot of other folks who are subjected to potential criminal accountability, not simply at the federal level, but in jurisdictions all across the country. And so people have to be vigilant and aggressive in making sure that the law is not broken in ways that help to lift up this principle of, a nation anchored in the rule of law, while we can, create the governmental moment to be able to revisit, what is clearly an inappropriate Supreme Court decision. There are some who actually believe that we need to introduce and pursue a change in the Constitution, which is the only way, other than the Supreme Court reversing itself, to have this decision revisited. That's a longer-term strategy for all the reasons that I talked about, but it is something that I think is worthy of pursuit, because this has been a foundational principle in the United States of America, that no one is above the law. And what the Supreme Court has suggested is that applies to everyone in America but the President of the United States of America. That's not right.
So the next question, I think, is representative of a lot of the anger that some folks feel in the aftermath of this election, and that is that Trump voters have made their own bed, in the sense that Midwestern farmers voted for the candidate who will now impose tariffs, and these will impact the Farm Belt most strongly. Likewise, the Gulf Coast and Florida will continue to be battered by hurricanes exacerbated by climate change, and yet, those are the people who, again, voted for a candidate who doesn't believe in climate change and who've been largely hostile to support in the aftermath of hurricanes. So how will the House make sure that FEMA support on those states doesn't happen without support for Western fire states, and also perhaps guarantees of reproductive freedoms?
Yeah, well, this is definitely going to be one. Even while we were in the minority in this Congress, we governed consistently as if we were in the majority. And the reason why we were able to do that is because the House Republican Conference was so divided that on the things that needed to happen for the country, including preventing a catastrophic default on our nation's debt, as an example, and there was the debt ceiling showdown, we will be up against the debt ceiling again in the early part of next year. And Republicans have consistently shown an inability to address that issue on their own and protect the full faith and credit of the United States of America. They will rely on Democrats to be able to try to get that done. And as we confront these moments of doing the business of the American people, including keeping the government open, which Republicans have consistently demonstrated an inability to do on their own, we've got to do it in a way that is consistent with protecting the values and the policies that we believe are important to the American people. And that, of course, includes equitable distribution of disaster relief to include all states, because natural disasters and extreme weather events, which are increasing in intensity, affect everyone. And they don't strike a state because it's red or blue, it affects everyone. And our response should be to be there for everyone. And that will be a core operating principle for us.
All right. Here's the question that's going to get you in trouble, so I'll ask it. Do you think an open primary held early on would have changed the results of the election?
I do think, one, that the vice president ran the best campaign that she could under the circumstances that she was in. And that, of course, and she ran it with grace and eloquence and strength and inspiration. It doesn't mean that when we look at the mechanics, as is the case for every campaign as part of an after-action analysis, that there aren't things that we may have done differently. And that relates to the House, the Senate, and, of course, presidential races. But I do think that President Biden made the right decision to pass the torch, and it was an appropriately selfless decision at the time, not easy to walk away from the highest office in the land. but that the vice president did have challenges in what was effectively a 107-day campaign. When Donald Trump has been a part of public life now consistently, unfortunately, as it relates to the views of many Americans for the last 8 years. And he never stopped running for president after losing. And so that, of course, presented a big challenge.
What safeguards are or can be put in place to prevent Trump or his cabinet from sharing classified security information with his authoritarian counterparts, for example, Putin, Viktor Orban, Netanyahu, and so on?
Well, I have a lot of trust in the national security professionals who are part of the apparatus that exists. And that's critically important. But it also does mean that we have to prevent some of the clearly unqualified people who have been nominated for some of these sensitive positions from ever setting foot in those positions. And several have now been put forth that are clearly unqualified and pose dangers to the national security of the American people. So that's the initial project that we've got to work on.
All right, and let's finish up with this. We've gotten about 900 iterations of the question, how do we get through the next 4 years? So how do we get through the next 4 years?
You know, it's a very fitting and appropriate question to end on. And, you know, what I've said to a lot of folks who are very disappointed in where we are is that when I was a young lawyer, and this was back in 2004, I was very disappointed at the results of that presidential election and thought to myself that you have a failed war in Iraq, a failed war in Afghanistan, you know, an administration that is mismanaging the economy, which eventually led to the Great Recession, so many people hurt, spends its political capital doing things for special interest groups, enacting large tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected in 2001 and 2003, inherited a budget surplus from a Democratic president, turned it into a deficit. How is it the case that George W. Bush at the time was reelected? What does this say about America? It was very disappointing. Now, it's interesting that, George W. Bush kind of seems like a traditional Republican at this point. But certainly at the time, and that record did not merit, in my view and in the view of many people, re-election. But he was reelected. But remember, at the same time that he was reelected, Barack Obama was elected for the first time on that same day in 2004. Even though 4 years prior to that, as a state senator, Barack Obama couldn't even get into the Democratic National Convention. He traveled from Chicago to Los Angeles in 2000, didn't have a ticket, didn't have the connections to get in, had to turn back around. 4 years later, delivered that historic speech at the DNC in Boston, and then in 2004 was elected to the United States Senate. And then, even though the Republicans had significant majorities in the House and in the Senate, in the aftermath of that 2004 election, just 2 short years later, Democrats took back control of the House in the 2006 midterms, and Nancy Pelosi became the first woman speaker in the history of the United States of America. And at the same period of time, just 2 short years later, in 2006, Democrats unexpectedly took back control of the Senate when all the pundits said, this is a tough map that will keep Democrats in the center out of power for years. They're saying the same thing right now, 2006. And then 2 years after that, in 2008, of course, Barack Obama becomes the first African American ever elected as president, shattering an incredible barrier in the United States of America, particularly given our history. And I'll never forget that day and what followed in 2008. And there were headlines all across the country and the world, including one that stood out for me from an important publication in Western Europe that said, in connection with the election of Barack Obama, America does it again. America does it again. And what I think that meant was that we're not immune, from the ebbs and flows of politics. We're not immune from the trials and tribulations, from the turbulence, from these swings of the pendulum. But as John Lewis would often say to us, when you see, some problems in society, when you see something wrong, you need to show up and stand up and speak up for what you know is right. You need to lean in to trying to get the situation turned around. And that's the moment that we once again face in the United States of America. And as long as we summon the will and the resilience and the commitment to do what generations of Americans have done before us whenever trouble has struck, and show up and stand up and speak up for what we know is right, then I do believe we can get this thing turned around in 2026, and certainly in 2028, bring about a situation where somewhere across the world there's a headline which says, America does it again.
And that's how you end a show.
Thank you all.
I want to thank Andrea and Writer's Bloc for putting this event together. I want to thank the Ebell Theater and the staff here for putting this event together. I want to thank you all for being here, whether you're here in person or virtually, because for you all to take time out of your busy schedules at a point where we are at a pretty low point in politics right now, to see all of you here coming out in person, taking time out of your busy lives to be here and to show that you are still engaged and activated in politics is what gives me hope for the future and what tells me that we have a rise coming up as we head toward 2026 and future elections. So thank you all for being here. And finally, thank you to Leader Jeffries. Very much appreciate it.